Chapter 5. Servant or slave? Barber was one of many thousands of people who worked in domestic service in mid-18th century England. London teemed with servants, some 50,000 of them, about a 13th of the population of the city. Johnson's friend Henry Thrale, a wealthy brewer, had between 18 and 20 servants at any one time at his country retreat in Streatham. But servants were by no means confined to the mansions of the gentry, with their retinues of 30 to 40, and the vast majority worked in households where there were only 1, 2, or 3 people in service. Compared with Thrale, Johnson was much lower down the financial scale, but his wife, Teddy, had kept a maidservant, even in the days of their worst money difficulties. The idea of the famously unkempt Johnson taking on a servant seems to have caused his friends some amusement. The biographer John Hawkins wrote, "The uses for which, Barber, was intended to serve this his last master were not very apparent, for Diogenes himself never wanted a servant less than he seemed to do. The great bushy wig, which throughout his life he affected to wear, by that closeness of texture which it had contracted and been suffered to retain, was ever nearly as impenetrable by a comb as a quickset hedge, and little of the dust that had once settled on his outer garments was ever known to have been disturbed by the brush. In short, his garb and the whole of his appearance was, not to say negligent, but slovenly, and even squalid." Hawkins's readers would have understood the reference to the Greek philosopher Diogenes the Cynic, who lived in poverty in a tub in the Athens marketplace, existing on a diet of onions. Johnson's lifestyle was somewhat less extreme, and his diet was a little better. Barber's duties in the household were not very taxing. As he later remarked, Johnson required very small attention. He appears in Memoirs of Johnson and in his letters, fetching and carrying, bringing a message, a cup of coffee, or a clean shirt, buying food, waiting at table, accompanying Johnson on his occasional jaunts outside London, and opening the door to a stream of visitors. Barber recalled 2 friends in particular who regularly called at the house in the early 1750s, both of them medical men, Dr. Richard Bathurst, who had placed him with Johnson, and William Damon, an apothecary who lived in Cork Street, Burlington Gardens. Damon seems to have been a particularly close friend of Johnson at this time. They dined together every Sunday and made plans for a visit to Iceland, though the trip never took place. Barber was later to work for an apothecary, and it may have been through Damon that this connection was made. Other visitors whom Barber remembered meeting at this time included Joshua Reynolds and David Garrick, the writer Elizabeth Carter, the historian Catherine Macaulay, and many other figures from the worlds of writing, printing, and bookselling. Some of those who arrived at the house were less welcome. Barber remembered that Johnson used to be disturbed by people calling frequently for money which he could not pay. Barber was just one of a number of permanent or semi-permanent residents who would be part of Johnson's various households over the years. Some were servants while others had more of the status of companions, but what all had in common was that they were needy and Johnson provided a home for them, and in most cases money as well. The house in Gough Square was a busy place, and inevitably some friction would develop between those who lived there. It is not certain who else was there at the same time as Barber, but there seems to have been another servant. When Bishop Percy called on Johnson in the summer of 1756, the door was answered by a maidservant whose nose had been eaten away by venereal disease. The 2 residents who lived with Johnson for the longest period of time, in each case, over 25 years, and with whom Barber had most to do, were Robert Levitt and Anna Williams. Levitt had been a friend of Johnson's since 1746 and had joined the Gough Square household sometime before July 1756. He was a medical practitioner of sorts, though he had no formal training or qualifications. He made an extremely modest living providing services to those who were too poor to pay for an apothecary or physician. They usually paid him in the only way they could, in gin or brandy, and he was often drunk. Johnson loyally explained that Levitt accepted payment in this form rather than have his skills go unrewarded. He was, Johnson added, perhaps the only man who ever became intoxicated through motives of prudence. In 1762, in curious circumstances, Levitt contracted a short-lived marriage to a woman named Margaret Wilbraham. Wilbraham was under the impression that Levitt was a physician with a considerable practice, while Levitt believed Wilbraham to be entitled to a large sum of money which was wrongfully kept from her by a relative. Perhaps each should have been alerted to the improbability of these claims by the fact that the couple exchanged their confidences while engaged in a business transaction in a small coal shed in Fetter Lane. The marriage collapsed, and Levitt found himself sued for his wife's debts. Shortly afterwards Wilbraham, who was in fact a prostitute, was tried for theft at the Old Bailey. Levitt was only with some difficulty restrained from attending in the hope that he would see her sentenced to be hanged. She was acquitted and vanished, and Levitt resumed his old place in Johnson's house and affections. Johnson was in fact very attached to Levitt, with whom he often shared breakfast around noon in companionable silence, but he had no illusions about him. "Levitt is a brutal fellow," he told Hester Thrale, "but I have a good regard for him, for his brutality is in his manners, not his mind." Levitt was gloomy and withdrawn, scarcely congenial company for the young Barber, but his presence in the house was not likely to trouble him much. The focus of Barber's discontents became the dependent who was to stay the longest and to establish herself most firmly at the heart of the household, Anna Williams. Williams was a woman of considerable talents whose habitual bad temper in later life had its origins in a series of misfortunes. Born in 1706, she was aged 46 when Barber joined the household. She was the daughter of Zachariah Williams, an amateur scientist who was an inmate of the Charterhouse, a charitable institution in Smithfield which provided a home for impoverished gentlemen. He lived there for many years but often clashed with the authorities and was eventually forcibly evicted in 1748, leaving him and his daughter homeless. He died in 1755. The woes of both father and daughter were substantially increased by the fact that by 1740 Anna was completely blind. In this grim predicament they came to know Johnson, who shared Zachariah's interest in scientific and technical matters. Like many others before and after, they became beneficiaries of Johnson's charitable impulses towards anyone who was in need. He was determined to ascertain whether Anna's eyesight could be restored. It was established that the problem was caused by cataracts, which were sometimes treatable, although only by a painful operation. Johnson arranged for this to be performed at his home in Gough Square by the surgeon Samuel Sharp. The operation took place just after the death of Johnson's wife, in other words, at exactly the time when Barber joined the household. It must have been a brief moment of high hopes, not least because Williams was a gifted poet and a linguist, and could dream of taking up her pen again. In the event the operation failed, and Williams remained blind. The only consolation to be derived from this episode, and it was a considerable one, was that she had found a permanent home. She remained in the Gough Square household and was to stay with Johnson, with short intervals, for over 30 years. For much of that time Barber was also present. Williams gradually took over the running of the Gough Square establishment. It was a role which was made much more difficult by her blindness, and some visitors were shocked by her habit of handling the food and eating with her fingers. Johnson's friend Giuseppe Baretti avoided dining with him, writing that "I hated to see the victuals pawed by poor Mrs. Williams, that would often carve, though stone blind." Barber did not appreciate Mrs. Williams taking command, and their clashes became a common event, the inevitable result of a high-spirited young boy being ordered about by a domineering figure. He was not the only one who found Williams difficult. John Hawkins, who knew her for 30 years, recognized that she was a woman of enlightened understanding who was possessed of excellent moral qualities, but also that she was easily provoked to anger, and he noted the constitutional asperity of her temper. As Hawkins recorded, Johnson found himself caught between Barber and Williams, and came to dread these conflicts, having his ears filled with the complaints of Mrs. Williams of Frank's neglect of his duty and inattention to the interests of his master, and of Frank against Mrs. Williams, for the authority she assumed over him, and exercised with an unwarrantable severity. Mrs. Williams, in her paroxysms of rage, has been known to drive Johnson from her presence. Anna Williams was in charge of the domestic arrangements, but both she and Levitt also provided company for Johnson, who seems to have enjoyed Williams's conversation as much as he did Levitt's silence. Barber was in a different position. We know the kind of tasks he was required to perform in the house, but his exact status is less clear. Writing 7 years after Barber's arrival at Gough Square, Johnson recalled, "I had a Negro boy named Francis Barber, given me by a friend." Many an 18th-century man would have referred to an apprentice or a servant in the way Johnson referred to Barber, but there is another possible way of understanding this turn of phrase. Could it be that Barber remained, in spite of his baptism, a slave? Barber's standing was clear while he remained in Jamaica. The laws of Jamaica declared him to be a slave, and the customs and practices of the planters left no room for any doubt at all about the matter. But things were very different when he arrived in England in 1750. Unlike the position in Jamaica, there was no formal regulation of slavery, no slave code laid down in Acts of Parliament. The statute law had nothing whatever to say about slavery in England. The reason for this was simple: there had been no need for Parliament to address the issue. Between about 1661 and 1711 there were several attempts at introducing legislation in Parliament to regulate slavery in the colonies, but significantly it does not seem to have even occurred to those who promoted the legislation to make provision governing slaves in England. Nor had the judiciary provided any clear guidance in the handful of court cases which concerned slavery. Some very old decisions dealt with the ancient status of villanage, a form of bondage which in some ways resembled slavery as practiced in the colonies, although the parallel was not exact. A villain, who inherited his status from his father, was tied to working on a particular piece of land and could not work away from it without his lord's consent. If the land was sold, the villain could be sold with it. He could own property, but whatever he owned could be seized by his lord. The lord could exercise corporal punishment such as putting the villain in the stocks, but he could not maim or kill, and the villain could bring an action for unreasonable treatment. Villanage was certainly a kind of unfree status, but it had died out by the 17th century. In the 18th century, however, a trickle of disputes started to reach the courts, forcing the judges to answer questions which had not been asked before. The cases arose because of slave owners returning to Britain, bringing with them individuals like Barber who had been slaves in the colonies. As early as 1569, slavery in England had been successfully challenged in the courts. The terse report of the case stated in full: one Carteret brought a slave from Russia, and would scourge him, for which he was questioned, and it was resolved, that England was too pure an air for slaves to breathe in. It was a grand statement of principle, but it proved over-optimistic when the courts came to re-examine the matter in the 18th century. In 1708 a case called Smith v. Brown and Cooper came before Lord Holt, the Lord Chief Justice. Smith sued Brown for debt, claiming that he had sold a Negro to Brown in London, and Brown had not paid the £20 due. Judgment was given for Smith, but Lord Holt refused to allow it to be enforced against the defendant. The reason he gave was that the claim stated that the Negro had been in England at the time of the sale, and as soon as a Negro comes into England, he becomes free. In 1749 Lord Hardwicke, the Lord Chancellor, disagreed, in the case of Pern v. Lisle. This was the case in which, as noted in Chapter 3, Lord Hardwicke approved the York Talbot opinion, to the effect that baptism did not change a slave's status. Pern owned 14 Negroes in Antigua and had hired them out to Lisle for £100 a year in Antiguan money. Lisle refused to pay 2 years' hire, or to give the Negroes back, so Pern asked the court for an order preventing Lisle from leaving England until the matter was resolved. The court refused to make the order, but this was not because there was anything objectionable about treating slaves as objects to be hired out, Lord Hardwicke declaring that a Negro slave is as much property as any other thing. The reason for refusing to make the order was that Lisle was going to Antigua, and the plaintiff could get justice from the courts there. The decision of Lord Holt in Smith v. Brown and Cooper was of little relevance to the case then before the court, but Lord Hardwicke nevertheless took the opportunity to dismiss it in a few words. The reason said at the bar to have been given by Lord Chief Justice Holt, in that case, as the cause of his doubt, viz. that the moment a slave sets foot in England he becomes free, has no weight with it. 13 years after Pern v. Lisle, the judicial pendulum swung back again in favor of the slave in the case of Shanley v. Harvey. Edward Shanley brought a slave to England in about 1740 and gave him to his niece, Margaret Hamilton, who had him baptized and renamed Joseph Harvey. Harvey remained with Hamilton for 12 years, until her death in 1752. When Hamilton was on her deathbed, she gave him a purse containing at least £700, saying to him, "God bless you, make a good use of it." Shanley was the administrator of Hamilton's estate, and in that capacity he applied to the court for an account of the money, clearly intending to challenge the validity of the gift. The arguments in the case are not recorded, but it is apparent from the judgment that Shanley argued that a gift could not be binding if the recipient was a slave. Lord Northington, then the Lord Chancellor, dismissed the argument, holding that Harvey was a servant, not a slave. As soon as a man sets foot on English ground he is free. A Negro may maintain an action against his master for ill usage, and may have a habeas corpus if restrained of his liberty. In the face of decisions such as these, Barber's status, so far as the law was concerned, was extremely uncertain, and no lawyer could have advised on the subject with any confidence. Of course, what the law said was one thing, but what people believed and how they acted was quite another. It was clear that in practice full-blown chattel slavery in the Jamaican form did not exist in England, in particular. Slave status could not be inherited, and there was nothing like the level of violence and extreme punishment which occurred in the colonies. But a form of servitude did exist, and this status exhibited many of the features of slavery. There were people in England who were compelled to remain in unfree service which was lifelong and unpaid, and with the possibility of being transferred from one master to another. Moreover, this status was racially based, only black people were subject to it. Such servitude had no formal official status or sanction, but equally no one was prepared to contest its legality until 1765, when the abolitionist Granville Sharp commenced the series of legal challenges which were to lead to the Somerset case in 1772. If it was not slavery as that was practiced in Jamaica, it was nonetheless slavery. Barber had experienced Jamaican slavery, and now he could see slaves on the streets of London, on the Strand, Fleet Street, and Cheapside. In some cases, the signs of slave status were all too visible. The following announcement appeared in the London Gazette in 1694. A black boy, an Indian, about 13 years old, run away the 8th from Putney, with a collar about his neck with this inscription, "My Lady Bromfield's black, in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Whoever brings him to Sir Edward Bromfield's at Putney, shall have a guinea reward." The wearing of slave collars continued into the 18th century, although they seem to have become less common. They can be seen in caricatures and portraits of the time. In Plate 2 of Hogarth's A Harlot's Progress, 1732, Moll, the country girl who has become a rich man's mistress, possesses both a pet monkey and a small black page boy, complete with turban and what appears to be a slave collar. Such collars were still in existence when Barber arrived in England. In 1756 a goldsmith called Matthew Dyer advertised in the London Advertiser that he would make silver padlocks for blacks or dogs, collars, etc. There was also visible evidence in the newspapers of slavery in England. Some of this took the form of announcements like Edward Bromfield's concerning runaway black men or boys, usually offering a reward for their return, and often a threat to anyone who might assist them. But there were also for sale advertisements. In 1756, when Barber was about 14 years old, by which time he had 4 years' experience as a house servant, he could have read this advertisement in the London Advertiser: "To be sold, a Negro boy, about 14 years old, warranted free from any distemper, and has had those fatal to that color, has been used 2 years to all kinds of household work, and to wait at table, his price is £25. In the period between 1709 and 1792 40 similar advertisements for the sale of young black men or women are known to have been published in England, and a further 8 in Scotland, and there must have been other instances for which the records do not survive, or have yet to be discovered. Lord Stowell, a judge who was a member of Johnson's Club and one of his executors, recalled in 1827. The personal traffic in slaves resident in England had been as public and as authorized as in any of our West Indian islands. They were sold on the Exchange and other places of public resort by parties themselves resident in London, and with as little reserve as they have been in our West Indian possessions. Such a state of things continued without impeachment from a very early period up to nearly the end of the last century. As if to emphasize the fact that slaves were items of property, they were sometimes transferred from one owner to another by bequest. In 1701 a Londoner called Thomas Papillon made a will which bequeathed to his son a slave whom I take to be in the nature of my goods and chattels. It would be wrong to assume, however, that all blacks in England were kept in this form of servitude. Without knowing the details of any particular person's circumstances, it is difficult to tell whether he or she was a slave or a servant. One factor which pointed to servant status rather than slavery was the payment of wages. This is an area where we know something about Barber's experience, but only at a much later stage of his life. There are entries in Johnson's diaries which indicate that he paid Barber 7s each week. However, Johnson's journal keeping was sporadic, and in any event not all his diaries have survived, so it is difficult to know when such payments began. The earliest surviving entry of this kind is a payment of 7s on March 18, 1765, when Barber was probably aged about 24. In surviving diaries for 1782 Johnson records that he paid francs 7s on 13th of August, 24 August, 8th of September, 14 September, and 25th of September. On 5th of October he paid Barber £2 2s, noting 6 weeks to Francis, apparently wages paid in advance. On 1st of October he had paid £2 10s to Frank for wages, suggesting that Frank was responsible for paying other household members. It seems likely that Frank was paid 7s per week from, at the latest, March 1765 until Johnson's death in 1784, but it is not clear how old he was when this wage was first paid. If objective evidence of Barber's status is lacking, what about the views of those who knew him, and, above all, what did Barber himself think? Colonel Richard Bathurst, who had been Barber's slave owner in Jamaica, had no doubt at all about the matter. When he made his will in April 1754, he declared, "I give to Francis Barber a Negro whom I brought from Jamaica aforesaid into England as freedom." It is a striking phrase, because it makes it absolutely clear that Colonel Bathurst considered that Barber's freedom was his to give or to withhold. In spite of the fact that they were now in England, and that Barber had not been a part of Bathurst's household for the 2 years preceding the date the will was drawn up, Bathurst still regarded Barber as his property, his slave. It was perhaps to be expected that an old plantation owner would cling to views which were universal in Jamaica. What is much more surprising is that Francis Barber clearly shared this belief, as he told Boswell in 1786 that Colonel Bathurst made him free in his will. The young boy felt that he was a slave from the time when he joined Johnson's household in the spring of 1752 until Bathurst's will took effect in 1756. He saw himself as still owned by Colonel Bathurst during that period and so must have thought that he was in some sense on loan to Samuel Johnson. Nor did Barber's views about his situation change later on, as 30 years had passed when he told Boswell that Colonel Bathurst had given him his freedom by his will. Johnson certainly did not believe that Barber was a slave. He was an opponent of slavery, whether in the colonies or at home, and would not have countenanced the transfer of Barber to any other master against his wishes. So how did he and Barber understand the nature of their relationship? The key to the answer to this question is Johnson's role in his Gough Square residence. At that time there was a widely recognized pattern of relationships within the home, in which the ultimate authority over all the residents rested with the, usually male, head of the household. This extended beyond blood relations to include apprentices, servants, and others, all those who were resident under the one roof. The central notion was the idea that the head of the household was a father figure, and that the residents were his family. As one manual of domestic government put it, the householder is called paterfamilias, that is father of a family, because he should have a fatherly care over his servants as if they were his children. Another very popular conduct guide, which went through numerous editions in the first half of the 18th century, instructed that your care must not stop at your children, let it reach your menial servants, though you are their master, you are also their father. When the word family was used in the 18th century it often referred to this wider group, in contrast to the narrower modern meaning of the nuclear family. The historian Naomi Tadmore uses the term household family to capture this meaning of a group of people who were resident in the same house and subject to the same authority. Johnson used the word family in this way, defining it in his dictionary as those who live in the same house. In July 1755 he had no blood relations living with him, his household being made up entirely of servants and unrelated dependents, but he recorded in his diary his resolution, to instruct my family. This understanding of the role of the father figure had consequences for both parties, and there were obligations on each side. So far as a servant was concerned, he was obliged to obey his master in all things. As one cleric preached in 1750 to those in domestic service, your time and strength are no longer your own. When you are hired, they are your master's, and to be employed in his service. A servant is supposed to have no will of his own, where his master is concerned, but to submit himself entirely to the will of his master, and obey all his lawful commands. The servant was expected to give to his master that same support and loyalty which he would give to a parent. The master, for his part, had the same authority over his servants as he did over his children, but he also owed them the same obligations. He had the right, and the duty, to discipline them, chastising them with reasonable punishment. But he was also responsible for his servants' well-being, both spiritual and material. He was obliged to give guidance concerning the Christian faith, to provide for the servants' daily needs, and to support them when they were ill or otherwise in trouble. This obligation was more than lifelong. A master should provide for a faithful servant in his will, so that he would still be looked after once his master was no longer there to take care of him. All this, of course, sounds impossibly idealistic, and it is safe to assume that what was written in the numerous conduct books, sermons, and guides to master-servant relations was not necessarily reflected in the behavior of either masters or servants behind the closed doors of their homes. But there were clearly many households in which at least some attempt was made to follow the precepts which were so widely laid down. In the case of Barber and Johnson, this notion of the paterfamilias is central to understanding their relationship, from its beginning in 1752 right up until Johnson's death in 1784, and beyond. Barber regarded Johnson as his father figure and thought of himself as a member of his household family, and Johnson entirely shared these attitudes. Again and again through their lives together, this shared understanding was to be at the heart of their actions. Johnson gave some thought to the matter of master-servant relationships, and contributed to public discussion of the subject. The best measure of a man's character, he declared, was how he behaved not in his public life but in his family. In his Rambler essay No. 68, published in 1750, he wrote, "It is, indeed, at home that every man must be known by those who would make a just estimate either of his virtue or felicity. Every man must have found some whose lives, in every house but their own, was a continual series of hypocrisy, and who concealed under fair appearances bad qualities. And there are others who, without any show of general goodness, and without the attractions by which popularity is conciliated, are received among their own families as bestowers of happiness, and reverenced as instructors, guardians, and benefactors. So the most reliable testimony of a man's character is from those who see him at home. The most authentic witnesses of any man's character are those who know him and his own family, and see him without any restraint, or rule of conduct, but such as he voluntarily prescribes to himself. If a man carries virtue with him into his private apartments, and takes no advantage of unlimited power, or probable secrecy, if we trace him through the round of his time, and find that his character, with those allowances which mortal frailty must always want, is uniform and regular, we have all the evidence of his sincerity, that one man can have with regard to another, and, indeed, as hypocrisy cannot be its own reward, we may, without hesitation, determine that his heart is pure." As a result, it was servants who were best placed to judge the character of their master. The highest panegyric, therefore, that private virtue can receive, is the praise of servants. It very seldom happens that they commend or blame without justice. There are very few faults to be committed in solitude, or without some agents, partners, confederates, or witnesses, and, therefore, the servant must commonly know the secrets of the master, who has any secrets to entrust. The testimony of a menial domestic can seldom be considered as defective for want of knowledge. In Johnson's case there was another driving force at work, one which informed all his relationships, including that with Francis Barber. It was his profound, and sometimes troubled, sense of Christian duty. Johnson was a convinced Christian believer, with a deep belief in damnation and salvation, but it was an important aspect of his thought that salvation was conditional upon what a person did. It could not be attained by works, but faith on its own was insufficient. How people lived determined their eternal destiny. So charity was of crucial importance, and it was vital for Johnson that he should regularly examine himself and his way of life, since he could never be sure about his own spiritual state. "We have hopes given us," he declared a few days before his death, "but they are conditional, and I know not how far I have fulfilled those conditions." For Johnson there was nothing in the slightest remote or merely theoretical about this way of thinking. To read his private record of his self-examination is to realize how deeply he felt about such matters. At Easter 1779 he recorded, "I am now to review the last year, and find little but dismal vacuity, neither business nor pleasure, much intended and little done. Last week I published the lives of the poets written I hope in such a manner, as may tend to the promotion of piety. I maintain Mrs. de Milan and her daughter, other good of myself I know not where to find, except a little charity." Johnson's estimate of his work and his charity is revealing about his scale of values. The little done during the period he was reviewing included publication of the first installment, volumes 1 through 4, of the Lives of the Poets, containing 22 lives. In addition to Elizabeth de Milan and her daughter, Johnson was supporting at this time Robert Levitt, Anna Williams, and at least 3 other dependents. Johnson's Christian faith was at the heart of his response to anyone who was in need. For Barber the year 1756 marked a turning point in his relationship with Johnson. It was during that year that Barber ceased to think of himself as a slave, and this transformation in his self-understanding resulted in the first important decision of his life. By then he was 13 or 14 years old and had lived in Johnson's Gough Square home for over 4 years, and become accustomed to its ways. But one day in the autumn of that year Barber walked out of the house, taking £12 with him, and did not come back.